Have you ever wanted to go to a Regency Era ball and meet Mr. Darcy? But exactly what do you do at a Regency Era ball? Are there rules? What are the differences between them? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today in this episode of Brit Lit 101, where we discuss classic literature like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and the historical context around it. My name's Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel. So if you like history or literature, definitely subscribe for these discussions. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is, first of all, reading chapter 3 of Pride and Prejudice. And this is the exciting chapter where we finally get to meet Mr. Darcy. And then we're going to be discussing more about Regency era etiquette and balls and all of that goodness. So let me know in the comments what you think about this ball and about the introduction of Mr. Darcy. Oh, it looks like we have people from Ohio and India and Canada and Washington and Estonia. That is so cool. Oh, hi, Brazil. That is amazing. Okay, so first up, let's get into chapter 3 of Pride and Prejudice. It says, not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises. But he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favorable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." In a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit and sat about 10 minutes with him in the library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, but he saw only the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honor of their invitation, and etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and she began to fear that he might be always flying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London, only to get a large party for the ball. And a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted the day before the ball by hearing that instead of 12, he had brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. And when the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity. For he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased. And not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance and being unworthy to be compared to his friend. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behavior was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged by the scarcity of gentlemen to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of that time Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes to press his friend to join it. "Come, Darcy," said he, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room who it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." "I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honor, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them you see uncommonly pretty." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings toward him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition which delighted in anything ridiculous. The evening altogether passed off pleasantly to the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough to be never without partners, which was all they had yet learnt to care for at a ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were the principal inhabitants. They found Mr. Bennet still up. With a book he was regardless of time, and on the present occasion he had a good deal of curiosity as to the event of an evening which had raised such splendid expectations. He had rather hoped that all his wife's views on the stranger would be disappointed, but soon found that he had a very different story to hear. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," as she entered the room, "we had A most delightful evening, a most excellent ball. I wish you had been there. Jane was so admired, and nothing could be like it. Everybody said how well she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought her quite beautiful and danced with her twice. Only think of that, my dear. He actually danced with her twice, and she was the only creature in the room that he asked a second time. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas. I was so vexed to see him stand up with her, but however, he did not admire her at all. Indeed, nobody can, you know, and he seems quite struck with Jane as she was going down the dance. So he inquired who she was and got introduced and asked her for the next two. Then the 2/3 he danced with Miss King, and the 2/4 with Maria Lucas, and the 2/5 with Jane again, and the 2/6 with Lizzie and the Boulanger. If he had only any compassion for me, cried her husband impatiently, he would not have danced half so much. For God's sake, say no more of his partners. Oh, they'd had sprained his ankle in the first dance. Oh, my dear, continued Mrs. Bennet, I'm quite delighted with him. He is so excessively handsome, and his sisters are charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace upon Mrs. Hurst's gown. Here she was interrupted again. Mr. Bennet protested against any description of finery. She was therefore obliged to seek another branch of the subject, and related, with much bitterness of spirit and some exaggeration, the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. But I can assure you, she added, that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he's the most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing. So high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so very great. Not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to give him one of your set-downs. I quite detest the man. Mr. Darcy is just getting detested here, guys. So that was chapter 3. Let me know what you think of chapter 3. What do you think of Mr. Darcy? Do you think that he is like just super introverted like you see in Pride and Prejudice 2005? Or is he really just being a jerk like in 1995? Or the actual book? So let us see what you guys are up to in the chat. Sometimes you just have to own half of Derbyshire, you know, to be the hero of a novel. Like, what else are you going to do in your life? Sorry. Mr. Darcy was quite noble. Also, why are you guys talking about food? Now you're just making me hungry. Mr. Darcy is definitely detesting everybody here. So let me see if I can actually make this work. Ah! Can you guys see my little title screen I put up? I am like such a new little live streamer here. I don't even know what I'm doing in my life half the time, guys. Okay, but what we're going to be talking about today is Regency Era Ballroom Etiquette. We see a great example of a little ball in this chapter where we get to meet Mr. Darcy. And one of the things that we hear about in this chapter is how wealthy Mr. Darcy is. Now, this is something I have talked about so extensively in my past videos. I'm not going to completely rehash here, but I would suggest after watching this live stream, if you haven't watched it already, to go see my video, Is Darcy Actually Rich?, where I break down his wealth and his income and where he would have stood in the social world of the Regency, and we get a better sense of like why he was such a big deal when he walked into that ballroom. So if you haven't already, definitely go check that out. Okay. So, are you guys ready to talk about dancing and the ballroom and ballroom etiquette? I'm very excited. I took notes once again because I'm just like super on top of things, guys. And we are going to talk about Regency balls. So, dancing was incredibly important in Jane Austen's era. It was something that was taught from a very young age. If we look at This illustration, what we're seeing here is actually a children's ball. So this could have been from like a local school where they would have had a dance master come in, teach all of the kids these ballroom dances. And then it was like kind of like those elementary school choirs that you make your parents come to. They would make all the parents and the grandparents and family come and watch the kids perform these dances. But of course, if you did not go to school, like Elizabeth and her sisters, you would have had a private dance master come into your home and teach you and your sisters, maybe your cousins, or like maybe like the Lucas girls would have come over and like practice these dances with them. Now, dance masters taught far more than just dancing in the era. They taught you how to bow, they taught you how to curtsy, they taught you the proper way to just carry yourself, enter and exit carriages. There was a big focus on learning grace and poise in all aspects, and this is one of the reasons that dance was so highly valued in the era. It was considered the way to give that refinement and elegance of movement to both ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, dance was considered incredibly important for women. It was one of the main ways they were going to attract a husband, but also gentlemen definitely knew how to dance too, and they needed that to be a true polished gentleman. So, other very important aspects of dance in the era was it was considered amusement. It was very much a social obligation. So going to these balls wasn't just for romance, it was also a social engagement where you're supposed to mingle and network and make friends. Now, this was something that we see broken in quite a few of Jane Austen's novels. For example, in Sense and Sensibility, we have Marianne and Willoughby dance with each other far too much. One of the reasons that there was a limit on the number of dances you could do with someone else was because you were supposed to be out there mingling with other people. And so they, by only dancing together constantly, not only caused some scandal, it was also offensive to other people. It's like, why are you avoiding us? Why aren't you dancing with me? And also in Emma, we of course know that famous scene where Mr. Elton does not use the excuse of like, I'm an old married man and my dancing days are over. That's not legit. In fact, married people were encouraged to not dance with their partners or like their spouse. They were supposed to dance with other people. So even though he was a married man, him asking Harriet to dance would have been not only appropriate, but also sort of seen as a social obligation since he was not dancing with anyone and she was currently sitting down. So dancing served so many different purposes, both socially and romantically in Austen's novels. And that's one of the reasons we see them come up so often. So, how are you guys doing in the chat? I'm like getting so thirsty. Do you guys just randomly get thirsty? Very true. You guys always make such the greatest points in the chat. Okay, so let's talk about the types of balls. Now, I think I have a slide for that too. Do I know how to do my slides, guys? No, I do not. Yes! Aha! I made the slide happen. This is far too exciting for me here. Okay, so there were two main types of balls you might go to in the Regency era. The first type was public assemblies. Now, what we see in this chapter of Pride and Prejudice is actually a public assembly. It's the Meryton Ball. Now, different areas would usually have their own ball. So, for example, the Meryton Ball would be the ball of the area, and it was open to the public. People could buy tickets to it. They would run a ball maybe every week in the winter. If it's a bigger area, maybe slightly less than that, like every other week, if they had less families that wanted to go to this ball. Now, these public assemblies were organized by different groups of people depending on who kind of like took it upon themselves in the area. This could be a private business enterprise, right? Like they're like, we're going to be the people hosting these balls for the area. It could be a local committee of people, like maybe the heads of several families are like, we don't have any balls in the area. Let's get one together and just run this as a committee. Something else it could be is being ran by a charity. For example, if there is a local school or a local hospital who happens to have like a big ballroom in their school or building, they could host balls there and then the excess proceeds would go to their charity. Or just someone who owns a big private building, right? They're like, I have this, it could host balls. Let me host some balls here. Whatever it was, there was some group of people that are like, we need balls. Let's make it happen. And this could be held in a large inn, held in the town hall. A lot of bigger cities had dedicated assembly rooms that were built for that purpose, like Bath and Edinburgh and Manchester. Now, who could attend to these balls? Well, basically, anybody who could afford a ticket. Now, some of them had special rules, like no tradesmen can come to this ball, right? They were basically aimed at a certain demographic, which is the upper middle class and above, right? Clergymen and officers and even like the local gentry, like we see the Bennets are going to the local nobility. Like the local nobility felt like they needed to go and make a little appearance at these public assemblies, which is, I think, something we see in Wives and Daughters too. Like everybody's waiting for the local nobility to show up, right? And it made it seem like it was like a classier affair. Now, again, these could be held weekly or every other week, especially throughout the winter when people didn't have anything else to do but go to these balls. Now, your family, if you were like really obsessed with the balls, could buy an annual ticket, right? Like where you can go to every single ball that they hold that year. And that is what Jane Austen's family did when she was young. That is probably what the Bennets have, right? They're going to every ball in Meryton. Or you could buy individual tickets. And this is one of the reasons you see that Mr. Bingley can move into the area and then he can be like, hey, I'm showing up to this ball with my whole gang, right? Because they can just buy tickets. Now, I think this is very interesting about public assemblies, which is that they often had rules posted, right? So there were like official rules posted somewhere in this venue that you had to follow. Now, these rules covered everything from the way you would line up to dances to how your carriage should drop you off, right? So, especially if you're like in a crowded area, it would be like, okay, when you're dropping off, your carriages have to be facing this way. And when you pick up, they have to be facing the other way. I just think that's funny that they're like, we have to tell you which way to have your horses facing. Otherwise, this is going to be like a traffic nightmare. So that is the public assemblies. Okay. So next up, we have private balls. Yay! So this is stuff we see like with the ball at Netherfield, right? Where Lizzie and Darcy eventually danced. That was a private ball. So, private balls, you had to be invited to them, right? Now, the invitations would usually go out like a week before the ball was held. And you were supposed to respond immediately whether you could go or not. You were supposed to go if at all possible, right? But if you absolutely can't go, then tell them you can't go immediately. Now, if you're throwing the ball, you want to invite either equal numbers of men and women or more men than women. Throughout the entire 19th century, there was this huge problem of men just not wanting to dance. And they would leave all these young ladies with no partners, like we see happen to Elizabeth in this chapter, right? And that's one of the reasons in the chapter when it says that there were going to be 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen, the girls grieved over the number of ladies because they're like, we already know that we might not get partners, but if you bring that many more ladies than gentlemen, we're really not going to get any partners. And so if you are throwing a private ball, though, you're supposed to kind of control this and make sure there are more gentlemen than ladies invited. Now, of course, these balls did not have posted rules, but they we're just supposed to follow the basic social etiquette rules that we'll be covering in a little bit, right? Like there were the rules everyone already knew about. Now, should we talk about setting up for a ball? If you are hosting a Regency ball, what are some things you need to keep in mind here? One is the floor. So, depending on what type of floor you have, it can actually be quite slippery, and you might want to decorate it with chalk. Like, yeah, like get some children's chalk and like draw on it, because when people start dancing, that is going to spread out and then make a nice little like less slippery surface so everyone's not like sliding all around at your ball. That does not help the romance here, guys. Or if you're going to be dancing over carpet, they would get like different types of material and like stretch it over the carpet to protect the carpet and just make it easier to dance. Now, if you could have a chandelier, that was ideal. If you were booking a band, get violins and flutes. That was like the it band to have for Regency balls, which I think we see a lot in like BBC dramas, right? There's always just some random violin players happening. How are you guys doing? Mr. Knightley definitely comes so in handy in Emma. And that's why everybody loves Mr. Knightley, except for the people who hate Mr. Knightley. But most people love Mr. Knightley. Okay. Now, when you think about a ball, there's multiple rooms and multiple things going on, and we often see that in Jane Austen's novels. So, first of all, there's the main ballroom, right? Where you have the dancers, you have the band, you have the chaperones sitting around on the side, you have young ladies like Elizabeth sitting down, waiting for a partner. So, that's where a lot of the action is happening. But to hold like the ideal ball, you would actually have more than one room, right? And one of those rooms would be a tea room for refreshments. Like after a dance, the gentleman you were dancing with was supposed to be like, "Oh, do you need any refreshments?" And then he can help you get some refreshments from the tea room. Or that's also a place for like the chaperones to go and like, gossip about all the young couples. Because, like, I mean, you need space to do that, right? And then there's also a card room. Now, we see in Northanger Abbey, for example, Mr. Allen, he went directly to the card room and left them in the mob by themselves. And this is where you would get a lot of like the fathers or like the older gentlemen or the married men just being like, I gotta go play cards. I'm out of here. Now, there is supposed to also be another room in an ideal situation. Now, not all balls had this many rooms to spare, but like if you were in one of those cities that had dedicated assembly rooms built for this purpose, you would make sure it was built with all of these rooms, and that would be the supper room. So supper was served about 3 or 4 hours after the ball started. In Emma, we see when they're trying to throw that ball, they're like, where's the supper going to be served? Like, if we don't serve supper, we'll be so not fashionable, right? So supper was essential. Also, what you were serving at supper was like kind of a status symbol, right? Like if you were having a private ball, you needed to have like the best food there. Okay. So that is kind of the setup, right? Like you're either going to a public ball or a private ball. You're going to go to these rooms. Your dad's going to disappear to the card room. Your mom's going to probably gossip with some tea. You're going to sit there and be like, why are there so many gentlemen not dancing at this ball? But let's talk about actually going to the ball now. So, when you first go to a ball, it's important to know if it's a ticketed or a non ticketed ball. So, by that, I mean like when a lady arrives to a lot of balls, especially if it's a public assembly, they will be given a small piece of paper with a number on it. And that will be their number for the night. Now, when they are supposed to line up for dancing, the master of ceremonies or whoever's lining them up will be like, number one, number two, number three, number four. And you were supposed to go up when your number was called with your partner. And that's how they decided who was going to stand in what position in those like really long lines. And so you needed to like keep that ticket with you, not lose it, and only go like when your number is called. Like if you tried to like go up higher in the line and stuff, like you'd get in trouble. They'd send you to the back of the line, basically. So if you were going to a ticketed ball, get the ticket and then hold on to it and then go immediately when you're called. Now, if you're going to a non-ticketed ball, then you're lining up according to precedence. So that is like whoever is most important to the room. I have so many videos on like precedence and social status and stuff if you want to delve more into that. How are you guys doing in the chat? Servants definitely gossiped a lot. Whoa. It looks like you guys finally did the poll until it completed. And you guys much prefer a book over balls? We just have so many Mary Bennets happening today. But it looks like private balls are winning out against public ones. Yeah, they were generally more preferred. But I mean, at private balls, you might more than likely have to line up in order according to precedence, which I think would just be like way harder than having a number personally, because it's just like you have to constantly know who's above you or below you in this precedence thing. Okay, so you get your number. You're in the ballroom after greeting the host and hostess of the event, and you need to start finding dance partners, but maybe you're new and you need introduced to people. So let's talk about introductions in the ballroom. Now, we're not going to talk about too much of introductions in general because I have a whole video where we talk about introductions. So I'm just going to go over some special rules that apply to the ballroom. Okay, first of all, a young man may request an introduction to a young lady so they can dance. This is exactly what we see in Pride and Prejudice in this chapter. We're just reading. Bingley requests an introduction to Jane. Now, a lady could request an introduction to a gentleman, but they had to check first. So this is a very interesting dynamic we're seeing. It's almost like flipped from what it would be normally, right? Like normally a young lady is the one that gets to be like, no, everyone has to check with me because like I'm so like protected from bad acquaintances. No one can just introduce themselves, right? But in the ballroom, that is flipped, where now gentlemen can be like, no, like I can reject introductions to ladies for like the only time in my life is in this ballroom. Now, the reason that is because it's all about dancing in a ballroom. Introductions in a ballroom were considered not introductions in real life. So if you were a lady and you got introduced to a gentleman and he asked you to dance, you more or less had to say yes, right? Like you couldn't say no to a request to dance unless you were so tired you needed to sit this one out, which that was still not getting rid of him, because then if he was like truly gentlemanly, he'd be like, that is okay. I just wanted your company. Let me sit next to you through this dance, right? Or if you are obviously already had someone else you were going to dance with, that was another reason you could refuse. Or if you were not going to dance at all that night, that is one of the reasons you could refuse. But other than that, you couldn't just say no. You couldn't just be like, no, I don't want to really dance with you, but I'll dance with this guy. No, like you didn't get that option in the ballroom. So, however, the special rule then goes, if the guy is introduced to you and you dance with him, you don't have to actually know him after that point. If you see him on the street the next day, you can completely ignore him. This introduction is not permanent. It's not binding. It does not create an acquaintanceship. It is just like, that was a one-time thing in a ballroom. Yeah. Where on the flip side of that, if a young man is introduced to a lady in a ballroom, it's assumed that he's going to ask her to dance. So if he is not planning on asking her to dance, then he needs to not get introduced to her, which is one of the reasons that we see Mr. Darcy not getting introduced to anyone in the ballroom, because he's like, I don't want to ask any of them to dance, so don't introduce me to them. Now, of course, this introduction in a ballroom not being an introduction in real life didn't apply if the lady did actually want to know him. So for example, when Jane and Bingley get introduced, Jane clearly wants to know Bingley. and her dad has already started a relationship with them, per se, between their families. So a lady could decide, guess what? We are now acquaintances now. And that guy would have to be her acquaintance from that point on. So we also see that, for example, with Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney. She clearly was like, we're making this stick. Like, we are going to continue to know each other, even though I could technically ignore you, but we're going to keep knowing each other after this. So I just keep losing my place in my notes, guys. So let us talk now about asking people to dance. So say you get an introduction, right? Now, this could be from the Master of Ceremonies at a public assembly, like we see the Master of Ceremonies is who introduced Henry Tilney to Catherine Morland, or it could be the host or hostess of a ball. Like, for example, someone could have gone up to Mr. Bingley or Miss Bingley at the Netherfield Ball and be like, hey, introduce me to this person over here. And they could do that. That was sort of their role. But once that happened, and the gentleman wanted to ask her to dance, he would be asking her for a set of dances. So this would be 2 dances back to back. Now, this is one of the reasons we see Mr. Collins before the Netherfield Ball ask Elizabeth for the first 2 dances. So that would be the standard number of dances you would ask from someone. And Elizabeth, of course, wanting to dance that night and having no other excuse, had to say yes. So now this is an important rule. Say you are Marianne and Willoughby, and you want to dance all night. Technically, that's not socially acceptable. There is a limit to how many times you can dance, and that is twice or 4 times, depending on how you look at it. So, for example, a gentleman could go and ask a lady to dance. Now, that was for 2 dances, right? But after they dance those 2 dances back to back, he could ask her again a second time for another 2 dances. So they'd be standing up together twice, but dancing 4 times. I don't know if that makes sense. However, that is one of the reasons we see in this chapter of Pride and Prejudice we just read. When Mrs. Bennet is recounting back all of the dances Mr. Bingley did, she said that he asked her for the 2 next, and then the 2 third he danced with Miss King, and the 2 fourth with Maria Lucas. So the 2 third is the 2 dances in like the 3rd position, and then the 2 fourth is like right after that, the next 2 dances. So she's counting them in sets of 2, and then we see the 2 fifth with Jane again. So they danced 4 separate dances, but they only got up together to dance them twice. And so that's how that counting is working in that scene. Yes, Henry Tilney is very classy. Oh, hi everybody. I feel like so many people are just joining now, but you guys are welcome, and you can always watch this in the replay. Okay, so if there are not enough gentlemen, a lady might have to sit down, which when we see Elizabeth sitting down for 2 dances, again, since dances were danced in pairs, that just means she wasn't asked once, right? Because like all of the dancing gentlemen couldn't like dance one dance with someone and then go ask her. Like if you're out for 2 dances at least. Now, one thing she could do though is have danced with her sisters. And this is something we see later in the story when Mr. Bennet is like, Kitty, you're getting all the rules because Lydia messed up. It says balls will be absolutely prohibited unless you stand up with one of your sisters. Now, this was allowed. However, it was only allowed under one of 2 circumstances, which is either there were just not enough gentlemen present, and thereby you could dance with like girls could dance with girls and guys could dance with guys, or you got special permission from the Master of Ceremonies or the host or hostess. So for example, Kitty could be like, hi, Master of Ceremonies. My dad won't let me dance with anyone but my sisters. Can I have special permission? Which I just think is hilarious. But poor Kitty. I do not think that there's any way Mr. Bennet is actually going to enact that rule. Okay, now let's actually talk about dancing. How are you guys doing? We did private balls. I am just like, oh, here we go. This is my title for this. I feel like I'm skipping so many of my title pages, guys. Okay, so we have dancing, refreshments, and romance. Of course, that's what we need to talk about here. So, dancing. There were so many different types of dances and stuff. Like, I can't even get into all of that here. But here are some essentials. One, you would want to make sure to line up with your number or according to precedence. Now, if some balls got so big, they would separate the dancers into two different groups and they would be like, okay, odds over here, evens over here. So you also had to like pay attention to the circumstances and know which set to join based on your number. Other things is you would probably want to wear gloves to this ball, though I have seen a lot of classic art where they're not wearing gloves at balls in this era too. However, the Ballroom Manual of Etiquette and Dancing says that you should be wearing gloves. But also, I love that it's like, unless you're eating, because no well educated person would eat in gloves. So, like, if you're ever wearing gloves and you're like, should I eat in these? The answer is no, because you're a well educated person and you're listening to random 19th century dance manuals. So, there were so many different dances done. But here is some general guideline of what to look like when you're dancing. It says the general carriage should be elevated and light. The limbs should be all braced and animated with the spirit of motion, which seems ready to bound through the very air. That is from the 1930s, the 1830s, The Mirror of the Graces by a lady of distinction. I always love when these etiquette manuals are written by like people who's like, my title is going to be a lady of distinction. I should just change my YouTube channel to a lady of distinction. But basically, you have to be ready to look like you're going to bound while dancing these balls. Just so graceful. And there was a lot of importance attached to how graceful, how light, how airy, how talented you were with dancing, especially as a young lady. It was considered a very vital way of how to attract a husband. Some people like debated over like how important should this be, right? Because there were like the people who were like, you know what? I feel like people should get married on like deeper aspects of life others than how you look while dancing. And then there were like the other side that was like, yeah, but let's face it, all the girls who dance really well get the husbands. It's just, I don't know. The debates they had in the Regency era, I just think are so funny. Anyway, after dancing, the gentleman should take the lady back to her chaperone or her seat. But there was a special time when you could hang out with the guy you were dancing with more, and that was if supper time hit. So you wanted to be dancing with your crush right before supper time, because then technically he had to take you into the supper room and you got to spend like the whole meal with him. So we definitely see, I feel like, some planning on the side of Mr. Bingley that he takes um, Jane into the supper room at the Netherfield ball. Now, however, if you did have a crush that you were like an advanced crush on, you could sort of book supper with them, right? You could be like, okay, do you want to eat supper together? And that was acceptable. However, if you were dancing with a lady previous to supper, you had to find someone else to bring her into the supper room. Like you couldn't just like run away from her. She needed also an escort into the supper room. So that's like a little side note. So maybe Mr. Bingley did that. Who knows? Now, this was, of course, the time when you could actually do a lot of talking, get to know them better. We see that happening over tea in Northanger Abbey when you get to know a lot more about Henry Tilney. Or this could be a time with humiliating drama, right? This is when the Netherfield ball just goes crazy. And it was right after supper that Mary Bennet goes into her beautiful singing. And then, like, Elizabeth's life is horrible. So, supper might be great. It might be terrible. It just all really depends here. How are you guys doing? Yes, he did. Henry Tilney had such an understanding of muslin, and that is an important thing to remember. Yes, conversation. You know, you could actually converse while dancing, but a lot of the conversation was really going to be happening at supper because like it could be loud in the ballroom and everyone just didn't magically melt away like in the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. Like, who else loves that part where like Elizabeth and Darcy are dancing and then suddenly the room's empty? And I'm like, where did everybody go? I mean, I know it's artistic, but maybe that's how that scene feels to them. Okay, so let me see. Ah, what did we cover today? Well, we read Pride and Prejudice chapter 3. We went over Regency Ball essentials like the difference between public and private assemblies and some proper etiquette you need to remember when it comes to going to a ball. Also, everybody remember that if you haven't watched it already, I have the video of Is Mr. Darcy Actually Rich? Which, you know, could be essential if you want to know about Mr. Darcy's actual richness or not. But it has been so awesome and amazing hanging out with you today. Thank you so much for everyone coming to this. I'm so sorry I'm a brand new like live streamer, podcaster person. And yes, guys, I know I don't think I actually announced this. I decided to turn this into a podcast, but look, I have a podcasting microphone and it's pink and I love it. So I was like, why not make this into a podcast? But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Let me know in the comments down below. Do you prefer public assemblies, private assemblies, or a book? And keep being awesome because you're awesome. Bye.